Welcome to this explainer, where we are going to dive headfirst into the massive, mind-boggling engine that literally runs the modern world. I'm talking about global debt. It is this invisible force that dictates the rise and fall of entire nations, and yet it's so widely misunderstood. So today, we're going to unpack exactly how this crazy system works, where it actually came from, and most importantly, where it might be heading. Okay, let's just dive straight into the numbers. $300 trillion. That is triple the size of the entire global economy, and it represents the total current debt of the world. Just take a second to process that. Every country is borrowing, every country is lending, and the end result is this truly astronomical figure. To put that sheer scale into perspective, think about it like this. If you stacked up $1 million bills, the pile would reach about 100 meters high, which is roughly a 30-story building. But a stack of $300 trillion, that goes to the moon and back 50 times. It's a number so outrageously large, it almost loses all meaning, at least until you start looking at the mechanics behind it. And that brings us to a really fascinating question. It seems so simple on the surface, but it actually reveals how modern finance is built entirely on continuous motion. I mean, if literally everyone is in debt, who exactly is holding the bag? Who is the ultimate lender in all of this? Well, this brings us to a super common myth. If we look at the world's most indebted country, the US, you might be picturing some shadowy foreign power holding all the cards. But actually, the US owes roughly 70% of its debt to its own citizens and its own domestic institutions. The US is essentially borrowing from itself. But how in the world did we get to a point where a country's survival depends on borrowing from its own people?
Section 1, debt actually predates money.
To understand how we got into this massive circular loop, we need to completely rethink our history and travel way back, over 5,000 years back. The anthropologist David Graeber reveals a shocking truth. Debt actually existed thousands of years before coins or barter were ever even invented. Looking at Sumerian debt records from 3500 BCE, we can clearly see that humans were operating on credit systems long before anyone was ever minting silver or gold. Graeber explains that early debt was really just informal community trust. He beautifully describes it as everyday communism. Now, that sounds intense, but it just means situational behavior based on mutual community expectations. Think about it. It's exactly like handing a coworker a wrench, helping a neighbor with chores, or giving a stranger a cigarette without demanding immediate payment. For most of human history, debt was just human sociability and cooperation. But around the Axial Age, things shifted dramatically. This informal, neighborly trust was suddenly replaced by mathematically precise debts that were enforced by state violence, armies, and what Graeber calls the military coinage-slave complex. Money was desperately needed to pay standing armies, and suddenly, owing someone became a matter of strict calculation and state enforcement. Section 2, the modern debt loop. Now let's fast forward to the 1600s, when King Charles II of England needed war funds. That's when we see the invention of the modern bond, which is simply a written promise of repayment with interest, and it changed everything. Today, especially after President Nixon completely ended the gold standard in 1971, fiat money moves in this continuous, self-reinforcing circle. You put your money in a bank. The bank uses your money to buy government bonds. The government takes that cash and spends it on roads, schools, and salaries, pumping it right back into the economy. The interest is paid back to the bank, which then pays it back to you. It is a closed, constantly spinning loop. And you can see here that the institutional giants use these bonds as a low-risk way to grow your idle cash. They've effectively created a hidden network that funds the government. Just look at this. Commercial banks alone hold nearly $1.8 trillion in U.S. treasuries. Pension funds place a quarter of all their assets in bonds, and insurance companies hold over 60%. So it's not some shadowy cartel pulling the strings, it's literally our own retirement accounts and savings fueling the government's borrowing. Section 3, fueling growth, risking collapse. So if the system is just governments borrowing to pay off old borrowing, why don't we just hit the brakes and clear the ledger? Well, the uncomfortable truth is that we literally can't. Debt is the very engine fueling our growth right now. Borrowed money funds 1 in every $4 spent in the US and nearly 1 in every 5 yuan spent in China. If a government stops borrowing, it has to stop spending. Businesses lose revenue, workers get laid off, they stop spending, and the entire economy just spirals downward. We are totally locked in. But on the flip side, when this borrowing does stop, or if it spirals out of control,
The results are devastating. When Greece faced a debt crisis and investors stopped buying their bonds, the austerity was absolutely brutal. Their GDP shrank by 25%, and wages fell drastically. Alternatively, if a country tries to just print its way out of debt, like we saw in Venezuela, you get staggering hyperinflation, where the currency basically becomes worthless. Both of these outcomes clearly show the razor-thin wire that modern economies are walking.
Exploring these huge cycles obviously requires a massive lens, and Graeber's sweeping historical view of these debt cycles has been widely praised for its incredible scope. Reviewers like Raj Patel highlight how his 500-page book masterfully connects 5,000 years of human behavior into a grand theory of how capitalism, religion, and the state all intertwine with our core concept of owing one another. However, to remain perfectly objective in this explainer, we do have to note that orthodox economists push back pretty hard against Graeber's work. Critics like Jeffrey Rogers Hummel and George Selgin point out what they call factual errors and fundamental misunderstandings of classical economic theory, arguing that his views on the origins of money heavily clash with established economic models. Section 4. Seeking refuge in gold.
But, regardless of the academic debate over the history of debt, the reality is that the fragility of this modern fiat debt loop is currently causing massive, real-world shifts in global markets right now in 2025. As investors look for tangible stability outside the debt loop, record sums are flowing into precious metals. Gold is up nearly 28% for the year, while the US dollar has dropped almost 9% to a 3-year low. Silver has touched a 30-year high, and mining stocks are up nearly 45%. When paper promises start looking risky, capital flocks for sure to physical assets.
And guys, this isn't just some fringe retail movement. Some of the world's largest financial institutions, we're talking JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and Bank of America, are forecasting massive, continued growth for gold, projecting it could reach $4,000 by mid-2026. They're actively betting on the need for assets that sit completely outside the spinning fiat debt cycle. As a prime example of this market reaction, let's look at companies like today's sponsor, Gold Mining Inc. They present a really intriguing scenario. Trading near a 5-year low of roughly 76 cents as of June 12, 2025, they actually hold massive reserves, over 12.4 million ounces of gold equivalent. And amazingly, their equity holdings alone are worth over $150 million, which actually surpasses their entire market cap. Backed by heavyweights like BlackRock, Morgan Stanley, and Goldman Sachs, it perfectly highlights how major players are seeking serious leverage and physical resources as the debt cycle just keeps churning on.
So, I'm going to leave you with this final thought. We've seen today that modern economies are basically running on a treadmill that cannot stop without causing immense pain. In a world completely propped up by a $300 trillion loop of promises, what will you rely on when the music finally stops? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I will see you next time.